50 million people. That's more than the population of Spain. And they're not in history books. They're in 2026, working in the supply chains that produce clothes, food, and electronics. Here's the truth most people never realize. Chances are, you own something made by one of them. And once that truth sinks in, it's impossible to ignore. Stay with this, because by the end, you'll never look at a shopping bag the same way again. This is Crash Historian, where history uncovers the hidden forces shaping money, power, and the modern world. Today, the focus is on modern slavery in 2026, the crisis hiding in plain sight. The one that generates $236 billion in illegal profits every year. The one embedded in global supply chains. And the one about to collide with new laws, new regulations, and a new global reckoning. Now, the natural reaction is often, modern slavery? That's something from the past. That happens in faraway countries. But the evidence tells a very different story. And what the evidence reveals changes everything. Modern slavery affects an estimated 50 million people worldwide. 27.6 million are trapped in forced labor, directly woven into global supply chains and labor markets. Consider the scale for a moment. That's every man, woman, and child in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland combined. And then some. Picture every person walk past today, every face on the train, every child in a local school. That's the magnitude of this crisis. These are not statistics. These are human beings. People working without wages. People bound by debt. People whose passports have been confiscated. People who cannot walk away. In the United Kingdom alone, 19,125 potential victims were referred to the National Referral Mechanism in 2024, a sharp rise from 12,691 in 2021. Between January and September 2025, that number had already reached 17,397. Labor exploitation dominates trafficking cases, accounting for 29% of all referrals between 2021 and 2024. Where does this happen? Care work, agriculture, construction, domestic work, hospitality, logistics, food processing, car washes, nail bars, the sectors that keep daily lives running, the industries depended on without question. Modern slavery and human trafficking generate an estimated $236 billion in illegal profits every year. Here's a figure worth pausing on. $236 billion is more than the GDP of countries like Greece, New Zealand, or Portugal. And yet, the people doing this work, they see almost none of it. The person making a t-shirt, they might earn less in a year than many spend on coffee in a month. That's not economics. That's exploitation. And whether acknowledged or not, everyone is connected to it. Let that number settle. $236 billion. That exceeds the GDP of many nations. Yet annual global spending to prevent and respond to modern slavery remains under $1 billion. There is a recurring investment gap of roughly $36 billion each year through 2030, a shortfall that undermines enforcement, weakens supply chain governance, and exposes corporations to legal, operational, and reputational risks. According to the International Labor Organization, eradicating privately imposed forced labor would require $212 billion over the next decade, barely 0.14% of 1 year's global GDP. But the money isn't flowing. Instead, the costs of inaction continue to mount: disrupted operations, unstable supply chains, legal exposure, damaged reputations, and declining workforce productivity. Modern slavery, at its core, is not merely a human rights failure. It is a structural market failure, one that shifts risk onto companies, investors, and financial institutions. Here's where it gets personal. That phone in a pocket, the sneakers on feet, the chocolate in a cupboard. There's a chance, a real chance, that somewhere along the line, forced labor was involved. It's uncomfortable to hear. It was uncomfortable to research. But silence changes nothing. This crisis isn't confined to distant developing nations. It is woven into the supply chains of the world's largest economies. The 20 richest countries account for over half of all modern slavery victims. India holds 11 million. China has 5.8 million. The United States has 1.1 million. The G20 nations import $468 billion worth of products at risk of being produced through forced labor: electronics, garments, palm oil, solar panels, textiles. The goods consumed daily, often without thought. In the UK, government assessments identify construction as especially vulnerable to exploitative practices. Cash-intensive sectors like nail bars are flagged as high-risk zones where organized crime often operates. The Council of Europe's group of experts on action against trafficking in human beings has highlighted agriculture, care work, domestic work, hospitality, construction, fishing, car washes, waste management, logistics, food processing, and warehousing as high-risk industries. These are not fringe sectors. These are the engines of the global economy. Now, if this feels overwhelming, that's understandable. This is huge. It's global, and it can feel like nothing can possibly make a difference. But here's what gives reason for hope. Because in 2026, right now, laws are changing. Governments are acting. Companies are being held accountable. And that's where the narrative shifts. But in 2026, the world is finally waking up. The UK's independent anti-slavery commissioner has published a futures analysis examining modern slavery threats through to 2036. The report identifies 21 distinct threats across 5 thematic areas, concluding that artificial intelligence, cryptocurrencies, and digital platforms are enabling traffickers to recruit, control, and exploit victims with unprecedented scale, speed, and anonymity. The King's Speech announced an immigration and asylum bill with proposals to reform the modern slavery legislative framework. Yet there has been no clear move toward increased proactive corporate obligations. The speech did not address calls for reforming corporate reporting on modern slavery or mandatory due diligence. Meanwhile, Greta has urged stronger prevention of trafficking in supply chains and improved enforcement of modern slavery statements. Companies with a turnover of £36 million or more are required to publish annual modern slavery statements, but there have been no sanctions for noncompliance. The injunction power has never been exercised. In Canada, the government has introduced Bill C-35, new legislation to combat goods produced using forced labor, establishing a standalone framework to strengthen enforcement. But here's the catch. Just when progress seems within reach, it gets complicated. Because when one country passes a law, another country passes a law against that law. And companies? They're caught in the middle. This is where modern slavery gets messy. And this is where the story gets interesting. In light of mounting import restrictions and mandatory supply chain due diligence requirements, China has introduced blocking laws. In April 2026, Beijing unveiled 2 significant regulations, one aimed at industrial and supply chain security, the other countering what it deems inappropriate extraterritorial jurisdiction by foreign powers. These rules restrict certain supply chain investigations and information collection. They allow countermeasures against foreign entities that cease normal transactions with Chinese businesses. Penalties may include restrictions on import and export activities, cross-border data transfers, entry and exit permissions, and fines. Criminal liability could also apply. Laws are colliding. Companies caught between jurisdictions face impossible choices. Entities conducting supply chain due diligence must carefully assess their exposure under these new rules, particularly regarding the breadth of countermeasure mechanisms and the potential for group-wide liability. So here's a question rarely asked. Where does all that money go? $236 billion in illegal profits. That money has to go somewhere. It flows through banks, through financial systems, through accounts used every day. And that means the system designed to catch criminals. It can also trap victims. Let that sink in. Modern slavery generates $236 billion in illicit profits each year. Much of this money flows through formal financial systems. Finance is not merely adjacent to exploitation. It is one of the few institutional systems positioned to detect, disrupt, and deter it. Financial systems include mechanisms to identify suspicious activity and safeguard integrity. Yet when compliance frameworks are not calibrated to real-world risk, they can also exclude the very people most vulnerable to exploitation. Survivors who cannot open a bank account leave no transaction trail. Migrants without recognized identity documents struggle to access regulated institutions. People in precarious situations often remain financially invisible, increasing their exposure to abuse and limiting avenues for protection or recovery. The challenge lies in implementing anti-money laundering frameworks that detect traffickers without unintentionally deepening exclusion. Pause for a moment, because that was a lot. 50 million people, $236 billion. Laws colliding, supply chains exposed. But here's why this video exists. Not to make anyone feel guilty, not to make anyone feel hopeless, but to show this isn't someone else's problem. This is a shared responsibility, and there are real actions that can make a difference. So what are the lessons from modern slavery in 2026? First, this is not history. It is happening now, in the supply chains that produce what is bought every day. Second, the profits are staggering, $236 billion annually, while investment in prevention and remediation remains dangerously low. Third, new laws are increasing corporate accountability, but they are also creating regulatory collisions between jurisdictions. Companies caught in the middle face real exposure. Fourth, the costs of inaction are measurable. Operational disruption, legal liability, reputational damage, restricted market access. And fifth, the financial system has a crucial role. Designed properly, it can detect and disrupt exploitation. Designed poorly, it can deepen exclusion and make abuse harder to trace. Modern slavery thrives in shadows, in complexity, in distance, in indifference. But in 2026, those shadows are receding. Laws are transforming. Regulators are watching. Investors are paying attention. And here's the truth. There's more power in action than many realize. Every time a brand is chosen that's transparent. Every time questions are asked about where products come from. Every time a video like this is shared, the shadows are pushed back a little further. The question is, will the lesson be learned before it's too late? If this video added value, hit that like button. Subscribe to Crash Historian, because understanding the hidden forces shaping money, power, and the modern world is the only way forward. And comment below, what shocked the most about modern slavery in 2026? The numbers? The supply chains? The $236 billion? The conversation starts here. See you in the next one.